Donald Trump expected Canada to respond the way most countries respond during a trade war, with tariffs, retaliation, public outrage, political pressure. But behind the scenes, something very different had already started happening. And by the time financial markets realized it, the fight was no longer happening at the border. It began with a single announcement, a threat that immediately sent shockwaves across Washington, Wall Street, and Ottawa all at once. The White House announced plans for massive new tariffs targeting Canadian goods entering the United States. Not symbolic tariffs, not gradual increases, but a dramatic escalation large enough to threaten one of the most economically interconnected relationships on Earth. And almost instantly, everyone assumed they already knew what would happen next. Canada would retaliate. The United States would escalate further. Markets would panic temporarily. Then, both governments would eventually negotiate some kind of political compromise. That had been the pattern for decades. Trade wars followed predictable rules. At least, that's what Washington believed. But this time, Canada wasn't preparing for a normal trade fight anymore. Because while politicians were arguing publicly about tariffs, Canadian financial institutions, trade officials, and economic strategists had already spent months quietly preparing for something much bigger. Not a counter tariff, not a symbolic retaliation package. Something deeper, something structural. And almost nobody inside the American political system appeared to fully understand it yet. At first, the White House projected confidence. Trump framed the tariffs as a show of economic strength, a pressure tactic, a warning, another demonstration that America was willing to use its economic leverage aggressively against allies and rivals alike. And politically, that message resonated with many supporters, because for years, Trump's economic strategy had been built around one central idea. America had allowed other countries to benefit unfairly from trade relationships for too long. And tariffs, at least politically, felt simple, direct, aggressive, a way to force concessions quickly. But global financial systems are rarely simple, and modern economic confrontations don't always unfold where politicians expect them to unfold. That's what made the Canadian response so unusual, because instead of immediately escalating publicly, Canada became quieter. And honestly, that silence mattered a lot. Behind closed doors, financial analysts began noticing unusual movements across several areas connected to North American trade and capital positioning. Nothing dramatic at first, just small signals, institutional adjustments, quiet financial repositioning, currency hedging, settlement restructuring. The kinds of technical financial movements that most television audiences never notice. But on Wall Street, people noticed. And the deeper analysts looked, the more uncomfortable the situation started becoming. Because gradually, it became clear that Canada might not be preparing to fight this trade war at the same layer where Trump had launched it. And if that was true, then Washington may have badly misunderstood the kind of confrontation it was actually starting. Meanwhile, public attention remained focused almost entirely on the tariffs themselves. Cable news panels debated whether Trump's strategy would pressure Canada into concessions. Political commentators argued over trade deficits. Business leaders warned about supply chain disruption. And financial markets started showing early signs of nervousness as investors tried to calculate how far the confrontation might spread. But underneath all the headlines, another realization was beginning to emerge. This wasn't only about tariffs anymore. It was becoming a test of how modern economic power actually works, in a world where countries no longer depend on each other the same way they once did. And slowly, very quietly, Wall Street started realizing that Canada may have been preparing for that reality long before the White House announcement ever happened. At first, most Americans barely noticed the shift. The headlines still sounded familiar: trade war, tariffs, negotiations, political pressure, the same economic language that had dominated global politics for years. But underneath those headlines, something else was beginning to move. And on Wall Street, that movement was starting to make people nervous. Because financial markets don't only react to what governments announce publicly, they react to what institutions quietly prepare for privately. And behind the scenes, investors, analysts, and multinational corporations had started seeing signals that Canada might be preparing for a very different kind of confrontation. Not louder, not emotional, not political, strategic. And that distinction mattered a lot. At first, the signals were subtle: small financial reallocations, currency hedging activity, quiet settlement restructuring between institutions tied to North American trade flows. Nothing dramatic enough to dominate television coverage, nothing explosive enough to trend online. But inside global financial systems, small adjustments often signal larger fears underneath the surface. And gradually, those fears started spreading. One analyst described the atmosphere as unusually cautious. Another warned that markets were beginning to price uncertainty beyond tariffs themselves. Because if Canada was quietly repositioning parts of its financial exposure, then this confrontation might not remain limited to goods crossing the border anymore. And honestly, that possibility frightened investors far more than tariffs alone. Because tariffs are predictable. Markets understand tariffs. Governments impose them, industries complain about them, then eventually countries negotiate around them. But uncertainty inside financial architecture? That's different. That spreads much faster. Meanwhile, the White House continued projecting confidence publicly. Trump framed the tariffs as leverage, a negotiating tool, proof that the United States still controlled the pressure dynamics inside the North American economic relationship. And politically, many supporters agreed. Because on the surface, America still looked like the larger economic power, the larger market, the larger military, the larger global influence. But modern economic power isn't only measured by size anymore. It's measured by exposure, dependency, flexibility, and the ability to absorb disruption when pressure suddenly appears. That's what made some investors increasingly uncomfortable, because quietly, Canada had spent years diversifying parts of its economic relationships, while global supply chains became more fragmented after repeated trade conflicts around the world. And now, for the first time, parts of Wall Street were beginning to wonder whether Washington had underestimated how much the global system itself had changed. The fear wasn't that Canada would win economically against the United States. That was never really the concern. The fear was something much more complicated. What if the old pressure tactics simply didn't work the same way anymore? What if allies had quietly adapted? What if countries exposed to repeated tariff threats had already started building financial alternatives behind the scenes, long before this latest escalation happened? Because if that was true, then the entire logic underneath modern economic confrontation could begin changing. And suddenly, this wasn't only about Trump, or Canada, or tariffs. It was becoming a much larger question about how economic power works in a world where allies no longer assume stability is permanent. Meanwhile, major industries inside the United States started watching the situation very carefully. Automotive companies worried about supply chain disruption, manufacturers worried about cost volatility, agricultural sectors worried about export uncertainty, and investors began paying closer attention to treasury markets, currency movement, and long-term financial positioning tied to North American trade stability. Not because collapse was imminent, but because uncertainty itself had started spreading through the system. And financial systems hate uncertainty, especially uncertainty connected to political escalation between major trading partners. That's when the atmosphere started changing. Not publicly at first. Quietly, behind closed doors, inside investment firms, inside corporate boardrooms, inside central banking discussions. Because the deeper analysts looked, the more it appeared that Canada was not preparing to fight a tariff war. Canada was preparing to survive one, and those are two very different strategies. The deeper analysts looked into the situation, the more one realization kept surfacing again and again. Canada wasn't preparing to fight back the traditional way. Canada was preparing to change the battlefield entirely. And slowly, Washington started noticing. Because historically, trade wars followed a familiar pattern. One country imposed tariffs, the other country retaliated with tariffs of its own. Then both sides absorbed political and economic damage until negotiations eventually reopened. Pain, pressure, compromise. That had been the rhythm of economic confrontation for decades. But this time, parts of the Canadian response appeared focused somewhere else entirely. Not at the border, not at the tariff layer, but deeper inside the financial architecture connected to trade itself. And that distinction mattered enormously. Because once financial systems begin adjusting, the consequences spread much further than politics. They spread into investment flows, currency positioning, bond markets, corporate planning, long-term confidence. And confidence is one of the most important forces inside the global economy. The moment confidence starts weakening, markets react fast. Meanwhile, public attention remained almost completely focused on Trump's tariff threats. Cable news continued framing the story as a high-pressure negotiation battle between Washington and Ottawa. Political commentators argued about leverage, economists debated inflation risks, supporters praised the administration for standing tough against trade partners. But behind the scenes, major institutions were already thinking several moves ahead. And honestly, that's what made this moment so unusual. Because while Washington was preparing for escalation, Canada appeared to be preparing for endurance, a completely different mindset, a completely different strategy, not emotional retaliation, not political theater, structural adaptation. And the more investors realized that, the more nervous the markets became. One financial strategist later described the atmosphere as quietly alarming. Not because anyone expected immediate economic collapse, but because for the first time in years, parts of the global financial system appeared to be adjusting to the possibility that American economic pressure no longer produced automatic political obedience from allied economies. That's a massive shift, especially for countries and institutions that had spent decades operating under assumptions of North American economic predictability. And once those assumptions start changing, financial behavior changes too, quietly at first, then all at once. Meanwhile, inside Washington, political confidence still remained publicly strong. Trump continued presenting the tariffs as leverage, a negotiation tool, a demonstration of strength. And from a political perspective, that messaging still worked for many Americans, because tariffs feel visible, concrete, easy to understand. But financial repositioning is different. Most people never see it happening in real time. There are no dramatic speeches, no televised announcements, no emotional headlines powerful enough to dominate public attention immediately. Just quiet institutional movement. And sometimes, those quiet movements matter far more than the speeches do. That's what started making Wall Street increasingly uncomfortable. Because analysts began noticing signs that Canada and several major institutions connected to North American trade may have already spent years reducing certain forms of economic vulnerability after repeated cycles of tariff threats and geopolitical instability, not abandoning the American system, not confronting it directly, adapting around it. And adaptation changes leverage a lot. Because economic pressure only works predictably when the other side remains dependent on the exact systems you are threatening to disrupt. But if that dependency weakens, even slightly, the entire confrontation starts behaving differently. And by this point, that possibility was no longer theoretical. Investors could see markets reacting to it in real time. Currency volatility increased, bond market anxiety started spreading, corporate strategists began recalculating exposure. And multinational industries connected to North American trade quietly started preparing for a much longer period of uncertainty than politicians were publicly admitting. That's when some people inside Washington began understanding the deeper problem. This was no longer only about whether tariffs would hurt Canada. It was about whether the United States had underestimated how much the global system itself had already adapted to years of economic confrontation. And if that adaptation was real, then future trade wars might no longer unfold the way Washington expected them to unfold at all. And once uncertainty enters financial systems, it rarely stays contained for long. At first, the reaction looked manageable. Markets dipped, investors became cautious, political leaders repeated familiar talking points about negotiations and leverage. But underneath the surface, the emotional atmosphere inside the financial world was beginning to shift much faster than most public officials realized, because this confrontation was starting to expose something much bigger than tariffs. It was exposing how fragile confidence had become inside the modern global economy. And confidence, more than almost anything else, is what keeps financial systems stable. The moment institutions begin questioning stability, everything starts moving differently. Bond markets, currency markets, corporate investment decisions, supply chains, long-term capital positioning, even alliances. And quietly, that fear was beginning to spread. Meanwhile, Wall Street analysts started warning clients that the real danger was no longer the tariffs themselves. It was the possibility that America's closest trading partners were gradually adapting to a world where economic pressure from Washington could appear at any moment. And if countries begin planning around unpredictability, they behave differently. They diversify differently, they settle transactions differently, they hedge risk differently, they trust stability differently. That realization was far more dangerous to markets than one tariff announcement. Because once long-term trust weakens, financial systems start protecting themselves automatically. And by this stage, that protection process appeared to already be underway. Inside major corporations tied to North American trade, executives began quietly reviewing contingency plans. Automotive companies worried about cross-border manufacturing exposure, energy firms monitored currency fluctuations closely, agricultural exporters feared prolonged instability, and multinational investors started asking a difficult question that nobody inside Washington wanted to confront publicly yet. What happens if America's allies stop assuming American economic policy will remain predictable? Because predictability is one of the greatest advantages powerful economies possess. Not only military power, not only market size, predictability, the belief that long-term rules remain relatively stable. And once that belief weakens, the consequences spread far beyond politics. That's what made the Canadian response feel so psychologically significant to many observers. Not because Canada had won, not because the United States had suddenly become weak, but because the confrontation revealed something uncomfortable. Other countries were no longer reacting emotionally to American pressure the way they once did. They were adapting structurally instead. And structural adaptation changes global relationships slowly, then permanently. Meanwhile, Trump continued presenting the tariffs as proof of American strength. His supporters argued that aggressive trade pressure was necessary to protect American industries and reduce unfair economic dependency. And politically, that argument still resonated strongly with millions of voters frustrated by decades of globalization and economic outsourcing. But inside financial systems, another conversation was quietly taking place, a much colder conversation, one focused not on politics, but on exposure, risk, durability, and long-term economic positioning in a world becoming increasingly fragmented. Because the deeper institutions looked into the situation, the clearer one reality became. This wasn't behaving like a temporary trade dispute anymore. It was beginning to look like part of a much larger global transition. a transition where countries, corporations, and financial systems were all slowly preparing for a future with less stability, less trust, and far more economic fragmentation than the world had experienced during the decades immediately after the Cold War. And honestly, that realization may have been the most unsettling part of all. Because once major economies begin preparing for fragmentation, they rarely return completely to the old system afterward. That's why the markets reacted so nervously. Not because investors feared 1 week of tariffs, but because they feared the possibility that the global economic system itself was slowly becoming harder to predict. And when predictability disappears, fear spreads fast. By this point, the tariffs themselves were no longer the most important part of the story. The real story had become the reaction underneath them, the quiet repositioning, the institutional caution, the growing realization that the rules governing economic power might already be changing faster than political systems were prepared to admit publicly. Because for decades, global trade operated around one central assumption: the world economy would continue becoming more connected, more predictable, and more dependent on stable international relationships over time. But that assumption had already started weakening long before this latest confrontation between Washington and Ottawa. Trade wars, sanctions, supply chain disruptions, geopolitical fragmentation, the pandemic, energy crises, currency instability. One shock after another had slowly pushed countries and corporations toward the same conclusion. Depending too heavily on any single system had become dangerous. And quietly, many governments had already started adapting. Not publicly, not dramatically, but strategically. That's what made the Canadian response feel so significant to financial observers around the world. Because the response itself wasn't really the message. The preparation was the message. The fact that an allied country appeared capable of quietly adjusting parts of its financial and institutional positioning before a major confrontation even began, that changed how people interpreted the balance of leverage itself. And once leverage starts looking uncertain, global behavior changes fast. Meanwhile, inside Washington, the political pressure surrounding the tariffs continued growing. Business leaders warned about rising instability. Markets remained volatile. Economic analysts debated whether the administration had underestimated how interconnected modern financial systems had become. And some officials quietly worried that aggressive economic pressure might now encourage even more countries to diversify away from American-centered financial dependence over time. That's the paradox of modern economic power. The more aggressively powerful systems use leverage, the more incentive other countries have to reduce dependence on that leverage in the future. And eventually, if enough countries adapt, the leverage itself begins weakening. Not instantly, gradually. Then, suddenly. That's what made this moment feel larger than a normal trade dispute. Because underneath the tariffs, a deeper global transition was becoming visible. A world where economic relationships were no longer built entirely around permanent trust. A world where allies increasingly prepared backup systems, quietly behind the scenes. A world where financial resilience mattered just as much as political alliances. And a world where confrontation no longer unfolded only through traditional retaliation. Sometimes, the most effective response wasn't matching pressure. It was adapting around it. And honestly, that may have been the deeper lesson financial markets absorbed from this entire confrontation. Not that America had suddenly become weak, not that Canada had suddenly become dominant, but that modern economic power had become far more complicated than simple tariffs and political speeches. Because in the modern global economy, size alone no longer guarantees control over outcomes. Flexibility matters, preparation matters, diversification matters, and increasingly, the ability to absorb instability matters most of all. Meanwhile, the political debate surrounding tariffs continued dominating headlines across television and social media. Supporters framed the confrontation as necessary economic toughness. Critics warned about long-term instability, and both sides continued arguing publicly about who held the stronger position. But underneath all the political noise, financial systems were already reacting to something much deeper: the possibility that the world had quietly entered a new era of economic fragmentation, where countries no longer assume stability will automatically survive political confrontation. And once that mindset spreads, global systems start changing permanently. Not through one dramatic collapse, not through one speech, not through one market crash, but through gradual adaptation. Quietly, strategically, over time. And perhaps that was the most important realization of all. Because the moment countries stop responding the old way, the entire structure of confrontation begins changing with them. Thank you for watching USA News Now. I'm Daniel Mercer.